Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session on the Great Game On. I'm Hans Enriches. I'm with the University of Sydney Business School, and I'm representing David Goodman, who couldn't join you. He was planning to come, but I will take his place for this session. I would like to start by acknowledging the tradition of custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand, and we pay our respect to the traditional owners who have cared for and will continue to care for country. Our session today will be moderated by Glenda Corporal. I will introduce her in a second, and Glenda will moderate our two speakers, their discussion and question and answers. For practical purposes, we'd like to ask you to put questions you might have in the Q&A function on the Zoom. We will take care of those and track the questions so we can come back at the end and answer those. Glenda is a Sydney-based journalist. Probably most of you know her very well, with a long interest in China and Australia's relation with Asia. She has visited China since the 1970s and was Beijing correspondent in 2018 and 2019. She specialized in finance and economics. She worked internationally in London, was a correspondent for the Australian Financial Review in Washington, New York. She was the first woman deputy editor of the Australian Financial Review and business editor of the Bulletin magazine. She's been working for News Limited and the Australian newspapers in various roles. She's now a columnist and is writing for the Australian. She is a member of the advisory board of the China Studies Centre and is also an adjunct industry fellow for the Australian-China Relations Institute at UTS. She has a commerce degree from the University of New South Wales and a master's degree in economics from George Washington University. She was awarded an AOM for her services to newspaper journalism in Australia. Today's session, I just wanted to show you it before I hand over to you, Glenda. Glenda, this is the book. If you want to read more, this is the other book, the previous one by Geoff Raby. And Glenda, I'll hand over to you to introduce our speakers.
Oh, thanks very much for that kind introduction, Hans. Geoff Raby, I think if you have any interest at all in China, you would know his name and probably his history. He's an Australian diplomat with an economist with a long experience and passion for China and Australia's relationship with China. He's probably best known as Australia's ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011. I'll just go a little bit into his CV. He's got a bachelor's, master's and PhD in economics from La Trobe University before joining Department of Foreign Affairs. One of his early assignments was to work in the Australian Embassy in Beijing as head of the economics division from 86 to 91. And again, those of you with knowledge of China will know that around 1989 was a very tumultuous and important period for China. And also along in that time, he also worked with fellow diplomat Kevin Rudd, who went on to bigger and better things. He was head of the Northeast Asia Analytical Unit, first assistant secretary in the Trade Negotiations Division. He's been ambassador to the World Trade Organization and Australian ambassador to APEC from 2002-2004, deputy secretary of DFAT, and then he was promoted to ambassador to China. Since leaving government, he's been a regular columnist and writer on China and Eurasia for the Australian Financial Review. He's also been a travel writer, a non-executive company director, and has his own consultancy. 2019, he was awarded the Order of Australia for his services to Australia-China relations and international trade. 2020, he published the book China's Grand Strategy, which Hans showed you the cover of, talking about the rise of China and trying to understand its role in the current global order. And he followed up last year with his latest book that we'll discuss today, Great Game On, which is ostensibly about Russia and China and Eurasia, but it certainly gives a lot of history to some of the issues we're dealing with at the moment. And it certainly proved very, very timely given the issues of China, Russia, and US policy. And he's now also updating his previous book on China. So Brendan O'Connor is Professor of US Politics and US Foreign Relations. He's jointly appointed between the US Studies Centre and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Sydney University. He's been a Fulbright Fellow at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., a visiting fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Centre in Washington, D.C., and is a life member of Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge. Brendan is the editor of 7 books on anti-Americanism, and he's also published articles and books on American welfare policy, presidential politics, US foreign policy, and Australia-America relations. His most recent book is Anti-Americanism and American Exceptionalism from 2020. He's currently working on 2 books, Conservative International Relations from Reagan to Trump, and The Ugly American from Jefferson to Trump. So we're going to start with Geoff outlining some of the main points of his book, and then Brendan will give some of his thoughts and start the discussion. Then I'll come in, and also we'll make time for questions from the audience. So if you can put it in the Q&A section of the Zoom. Thank you. Over to you, Geoff.
Oh, well, thanks, Glenda, for the very kind introduction, and Hans, thank you very much for convening this session, and I look forward very much to the conversation with Brendan. So, Great Game On really is a book about the next big power shift that's happened in the world. My previous book, at its essence, was about the power shift from the US to China, driven by China's 4 decades of astonishing economic growth. That basically changed the global order, and today we have essentially a multipolar order. And what we're seeing now in Eurasia is a similar power shift from Russia to China, which might very soon, if it hasn't already, leave China as the sole dominant power of Eurasia. And for geopolitical thinkers and people interested in the subject, this is quite a big deal. So the genesis of the book was me watching the extraordinary scenes of the collapse of Kabul and the US NATO forces' chaotic withdrawal from Kabul. And as I was watching that, people of my generation, my age, we would all feel the same. It was just like watching the fall of Saigon in 1975 and the chaotic scenes of US helicopters leaving the CIA building, the roof of the CIA building in central Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, of course, in Vietnam. Then the capital of South Vietnam, a country that no longer exists, and people struggling to get onto the helicopters to be taken out before the communists took over. But watching that, I realized that what I was looking at was not an evacuation or retreat from a single country, as it was in the case of Vietnam. With the fall of Kabul and the departure of the US NATO forces, this was a very historic moment, a huge historic moment, because what it marks is the first time in over 300 years that the West hasn't had a prominent position in Eurasia or been present in Eurasia before. I mean, for the last 300 years, the contest for influence and dominance in Eurasia has been between 3 major empires. The Qing, Chinese Empire, the Russian, expanding under the Tsars, and Great Britain. And so this is quite an extraordinary thing to think that now there's only 2 empires competing for influence and preeminence in Eurasia, that of Russia and China. Just before I go on, Glenda, I might just give a little bit of definition about the geography and the concepts of Eurasia and so on. Clearly, and for reasonable reasons, Eurasia is not the first thing on people's minds in Australia most days. So I define Eurasia, and it's like Humpty Dumpty. It is whatever you'd like it to be. But generally in the literature, I think there's a sort of convergence around the notion of Eurasia being all of that area from the Vistula River east in Poland to the Sea of Japan. It's a huge area, contains vast populations and extraordinary and massive resources, especially in hydrocarbons, energy, LNG, crude oil, and so on. And it's a vast territory, and it's always been seen of great geopolitical importance because of that, and the fact that so many empires have been connected to or fought against each other in Eurasia. And there have been many theories about the dominance and control of Eurasia. And in fact, at the beginning of the 20th century, the British geopolitical strategist Halford Mackinder defined Eurasia as the heartland of the world, and that basically came up with a formula that geopolitical heartland came up with a formula that he who controls Eurasia, or the state that controls Eurasia, controls the world. And although things haven't quite worked out like that, and there's if you like, a competitive rimland theory that was developed by Spikeman, a Harvard geopolitical scientist, after the Second World War, around the 1940s. This theory of the heartland still prevails in so much geopolitical thinking and strategy, and so much so that in the middle of the 1990s, former President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard. And in that, he said the US must never abandon its position in Eurasia, for if it does, US primacy will fall. And I think it's very telling now, and it comes back to my observation of the retreat from Kabul, that gives this sense of moment and historic importance and strategic interest in what has happened. So that's Eurasia. And just quickly with definitions, within the Eurasian envelope, if you like, there's a region called core Eurasia, and that's probably pretty much what my book's about. And that's the 5 stands plus Afghanistan and Mongolia. And then there's the Central Asia states, which are the 5 stands: Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. And that is an area that's under great play at the moment between China and Russia. And I write a lot about that in the book as well. So that's by way of an introduction to where I came from, Glenda, and the subject matter that's covered in the book.
Brendan, do you want to come in with some comments or questions? You're on mute, Brendan.
Yes, someone had to do that, didn't they? Okay, well, first of all, I'd just like to say it's a terrific book. I am not an expert on Central Asia or Core Asia or Core Eurasia, as you call it, Geoff, but I learned so much reading this book. I thought it was really relevant to my general interests in US-China relations and US foreign policy. If you're just interested in the world or history or travel logs, there's much in the book. But that part of the world, as you say, I think for Australians, for many of us, is unfamiliar. Not many people have traveled to it. I think you paint a really sort of vivid picture in your 1989 travels into Xinjiang, that in some ways you consider Xinjiang part of this kind of core Eurasia, or at least on the edge of it, significant in many ways. So maybe you could start us off by painting somewhat of a picture, and this is, I think, one of the real charms of the book, that one feels not just thinking about the big questions, but some intimacy with this area, about how these were great cities, how these were places of colonial kind of buildings, and particularly in Xinjiang. I think that was somewhat unfamiliar to me, the kind of urban geography of the main cities of this core Eurasia. How did you find them on your travels, and maybe in what state are they today?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Xinjiang's very interesting, and it's the longest chapter in the book, and I found on one hand the most challenging to write, but on the other hand, for that reason, I guess, the most intellectually satisfying. Xinjiang is most definitely part of core Eurasia, and I treat Xinjiang in the book as a separate entity from the PRC. I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form, obviously, that Xinjiang is not part of the People's Republic of China. It patently is, but that culturally, ethnically, historically, in every way you want to look at it, Xinjiang looks west. The language is predominantly Turkic. The religion is Islamic. In the 19th century, modernizing, reforming Islamic scholars had a huge impact over Xinjiang, over the education system, even when it was back in the Qing domain. Other cities, obviously, the gem in this whole area was Kashgar, and Kashgar is in the southwest of Xinjiang. It was a major oasis city for the Silk Road. It sits on the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, and to the south of Xinjiang, to the south of Kashgar, are the Pamir Mountains, which are high and snow-covered all year round, and to the west of Kashgar is the Tian Shan Mountains, and the Tian Shan Mountains actually divide West Turkestan from East Turkestan. And so another name for Xinjiang historically has been East Turkestan, the lands to the east of the Tian Shan mountain range. So it's a fantastic place, fantastic location. And I was fortunate to make a road trip there just when that part of China was opening up. I went there in February '89, not realizing how remote and how cold it was and how difficult it was to get there. But when I got there, I found the most extraordinary ancient mud brick city with streets full of specialized merchants, one street selling silver bracelets, one street selling carpets, one street selling knives. And every Sunday morning, there was a massive market. And even before the sun came up, you could hear camels moving past your hotel room, and merchants, farmers with their donkey carts whipping them along, trying to get the best position in the market to their commercial advantage. Just extraordinary. And it was just like being back in the Middle Ages. So that's one place that's very, very special. Unfortunately, as in much of China, economic development, economic growth has seen the city change. When I was there was a new city outside the old mud brick city, but the mud brick city's been redeveloped, and the physical characteristics of it have changed substantially. I must say, though, I was last there in 2017, and at first sight, it's very disappointing to see how much has been modernized. But there's something about a place like Kashgar that after 2 or 3 days, there's an energy, a vibe, as we used to say in my hippie youth, whatever. You just start to feel the old Kashgar. So that's fascinating. I won't keep going through all the cities, but in Central Asia, cities like Samarkand, obviously, you need to understand that Uzbekistan is largely Persian influence, but Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Xinjiang are all Turkic influence. So Uzbekistan has these wonderful cities like Samarkand. Everyone knows about it these days, with incredible examples of blue, turquoise, Persian porcelain and mosques and minarets and everything. So it's fascinating, the whole place still.
In the 19th century, I mean, there's a lot of great history in there about British kind of ideas of Russian expansion into this area, or sort of jumping at shadows, and you make parallels with some of the arguments in the McCarthyist period about the communist world being on the march and all the communists being the same. Why was this region for the British seen, particularly this kind of core Eurasia, as this kind of fulcrum of world politics? What was it about it that made it in this way kind of more central than I think people kind of tend to realize?
Yeah, very, very good point, Baron. Look, this is the great game. This is absolutely the great game. And it is fascinating, and there are so many lessons to be drawn from that, and it resonates so much with what's happening today in the world in geopolitics. Basically, the Great Game, it's a bit flexible where you date it start, but say sometime in the 1840s. It definitely ended, though, in 1907 when Great Britain and Russia signed a convention of accommodation with each other. In between those years, 70 years, British so-called forwardists, we'd call them China hawks today, but British so-called forwardists in the newspapers in London, in the Parliament, in the universities, and so on, were convinced, or at least they tried to convince a broader population in the UK or Britain that Tsarist Russia, which was expanding across Central Asia, its real purpose was to take British India. And, this was the great imperial prize of Britain. And so there was this view that that Russia expanding across down to Persia, on the borders of Afghanistan, which Britain saw as its sphere of influence, and through Central Asia, as I just described Central Asia, all those areas were falling to the Tsars, and that Russia was on the march to take India from Britain, and that was the real purpose. Now, this has to be understood in the context of relative power shifts, and the notion of relative power shifts runs all the way through my book. And it's very important to understand the arguments. Britain was the dominant power, Tsarist Russia was the ascendant power, and in a very sort of Thucydides way, the dominant power sought to suppress the rising power. And so the forwarders saw Russia on the march across these vast areas of Eurasia, and tried to prevent them getting closer and closer to British India, and would contest them. They never fought open battles. There was never a war between Britain and Russia in Central Asia, but there was a constant game, which we call the Great Game, of cat and mouse, foxy moves, a whole cast. They're hilarious of spies, of grandees, of adventurers, of crazy people, constantly on the move. And back to Kashgar, still today, the Russian consulate building and the British consulate building are still standing in Kashgar from that time. And this great game was conducted between those two consulates in Kashgar. And that itself is fascinating to go to those consulate buildings and to see this. So I liken it very much in the book to akin to the China threat today. I mean, no one really establishes the China threat. It's asserted. It's true by definition, but it's never really understood or analysed. And this is the same. And there was no evidence at all that St. Petersburg ever had its eyes on India. And a moment's reflection on the vertiginous passes of the Pamirs or the Hindu Kush or the Himalaya, and it's nonsense. And the only way they could get through in any sensible way would be through the Khyber Pass, which Britain controlled. And if you stand in the Khyber Pass of the Pakistan side and look into Afghanistan, then any assault from there had to be up very, very steep mountain slopes. None of it makes any sense. As Lord Salisbury, who was Secretary of State at one stage in the Parliament, said, he himself was a forwardist, but he was so exasperated by some of his colleagues talking about the Russian threat to India, that he said something like, if the honourable gentleman in the chamber would look at the map in feet rather than inches, they would be more relaxed. So it was an amazing period. And of course, you go around the coast of Australia, the southern areas of Australia, and you'll find cannons and batteries all directed against the Russian threat of the 1880s and 1890s, and never once a shot was fired in anger. I suspect there's some lessons there for AUKUS, but that's for another discussion.
I'll bring you up to the current. I mean, I was thinking of walking my sons around those Newcastle fort, the fort in Newcastle Harbour near the beach there, the Wollongong Middle Head, to think that they were all built for the impending Russian sort of fleet coming in as there's a lot of nice touches which draw the book back, like those stories to Australia, bring Australian readers in. If we bring the story up to date, there's a great chapter on the Cold War that's not told between the Soviet Union and China, and how in 1969 particularly, how tense that was. And many of us are obsessed with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and those who've seen the Dylan movie recently, there's a great scene of the sort of night of the Cuban Missile Crisis seeming like the world, or at least New York, was going to end. So you paint that great picture of this, very much an up and down relationship with the Soviets and then the Russians. If the Russian-Chinese relationship does change in its dimension and return to being a rivalry, is it this area of sort of core Eurasia that you see as a potential sort of flashpoint, or is it more what you're calling kind of outer Manchuria, the sort of areas that Russia took when their opportunities were there, that would be potential flashpoints? Or is geopolitics not the most likely way that relationship would return to being a much more testy relationship?
Yeah, well, short answer is Russia is most vulnerable in what we know as the Russian Far East. And I'll talk about that in a bit more, but just some sort of context. Of course, Xinjiang now is bordered by independent Central Asian states. And there's a great affinity in language, culture, and so on. But where once that border with Xinjiang was extremely vulnerable to the rulers in Beijing, and was a constant source of anxiety. And the Russians in the 19th century, and again in the Soviet Union, even when they were sort of fraternal communist so-called partners of the communists in China, made various encroachments in Xinjiang. Russia has always seen Xinjiang as being naturally part of its Central Asian empire, but of course it's lost all of that with the breakup of the Soviet Union. The security risk to that area comes very much from Islamic fundamentalism, and that's a problem with how with the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and that is a threat to Xinjiang. So the real area I think that's contentious is this enormous area north of the Amur River and across to the Sea of Japan, which is basically known as the Russian Far East. It's the best way of visualizing where it is, but it includes parts of Manchuria, which have always been traditionally Chinese. So the Soviet-Chinese split between the Communist parties occurred in 1961, and it was a mix of a lot of things, both in terms of tension in that relationship between whether China would ever be treated by the Soviets as an equal partner rather than a little brother. And this was a very big thing for Mao Zedong. International events in the 62 China-India War, Moscow backed Delhi against its fraternal communist ally in Beijing. Khrushchev always saw Chairman Mao as being an adventurer internationally and ran the risk of promoting or provoking nuclear war with the Americans. And Moscow was trying to work it wasn't called détente there, but it was trying to work its way towards some sort of a détente, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So tensions, for a whole lot of reasons, just continued to worsen between China and the Soviet Union. And yes, by 1969, the Chinese really believed that there was going to be a Soviet nuclear attack on the Lopnor nuclear facilities and sites in the Gobi Desert, which is on the edge of Xinjiang, and or Beijing itself. And a new biography of Zhou Enlai has just come out by a Chinese academic in Oxford, in Harvard rather, Chen Jian. And what I hadn't realized till I read that just recently is that the whole of the leadership in Beijing in '69 had been evacuated, and spread out around the whole country. That's how real for them the threat was. And in 69, there was fighting, serious fighting over some months on the Ussuri River. And the Ussuri River effectively runs north from Manchuria to the Amur River, not far if you look at the map from Vladivostok. It is quite a long way if you have to sort of walk or ride a bicycle, but for a map at a certain distance, it looks like they're fairly near. So then that all eventually was settled down, and they have agreed, and the final agreement really on borders didn't occur till 2008. So the borders are all sort of settled. The problem is that Russia occupies over 1 million square kilometers of territory north of the Amur River to the Sea of Japan. And this was lost in the 19th century to unequal treaties imposed on the Qing dynasty by the Russians in St. Petersburg. Now, the Communist Party forever talks in its propaganda about the unequal treaties that Qing had to bear, and that Xi Jinping, with his rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, a big part of that is to right the wrongs from the unequal treaties, and also, of course, to reunify with Taiwan. But of all the land that was lost to the Qing under unequal treaties, only the territory taken by Russia has not been returned. And today there is still an underlying sense that that land is Chinese and should be returned. And of course, it's vast territory, rich in natural resources. Much of the resources still haven't been properly developed. And the Chinese, you can imagine, thinking, well, we could do that job. We've done that before. And since Putin's invasion of Ukraine, he so weakened and depleted Russia, and so many military resources have gone from the Far East to the Western Front in Europe, that largely that territory is undefended or undefendable. Now, I'm not saying China anytime soon is going to press its advantage, and maybe it never will, but it certainly is an ongoing source of mistrust and uncertainty, especially for Moscow. It will never trust China's intentions in that part of the world. And to make the point from the Chinese side, in April 2023, the ministry in Beijing responsible for the names on maps issued a decree that said of 8 cities in Russia that were formerly Chinese territory, they now must be referred to by their original Chinese name, not the Chinese transliteration of the Russian. So one of these cities will be well known to everyone as Vladivostok on the Sea of Japan, Moscow's only warm water port. And that had a pre-existing Chinese name. It was only a little fishing village before the Russians came, called Haishanwan. And Haishanwan became Vladivostok in Russian, and Vladivostok translates into English as conqueror of the East. So it gives you an idea what the Russians are up to. And now, under the new decree, Vladivostok now must again be called Haishanwan. So, Moscow issued a formal diplomatic protest against it, muted because we're in the moment of the height of the Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin friendship without limits. But this is highly significant. And then around the same time, Xi Jinping was visiting Moscow, and a blogger in Shanghai with a huge following started blogging that if Xi Jinping is serious about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, he would ask Putin for all that land back. Of course, he was shut down within a few hours, but every now and then something like this happens, and it really flares up. And you can't underestimate the force of Chinese nationalism, partly fed by the Communist Party's incessant propaganda about the unequal treaties. But the only unequal treaty that hasn't been, or two, that hasn't been righted is the Treaty of Aijun of 1858, which gave the land north of the Amur, and then the Treaty of Peking, which gave the land east of the Ussuri River to Vladivostok and the Sea of Japan to Russia.
Yeah, no, you've done us a great favor, I think, getting us to think about that area of the world. As I said, many people don't. This is my last question. So, as I said, my own area is really American politics and foreign policy. And during the first Trump administration, towards the end, Mike Pompeo was to make much of Chinese behavior in Xinjiang. And obviously, we have a lot of kind of whataboutism as a form of analysis, I think often overdone and not particularly useful. But is it like it may be likely at some point when criticism is rightly directed at the Trump administration that it will say, well, look at China and look at the treatment of people in Xinjiang, and this will be a deflecting tactic. But I suppose someone as expert as yourself on this topic, what have really been the activities of the Chinese Communist Party in Xinjiang over the last 10 years, and what really are their aim? What is the aims of these general policies that they've been instituting in that region?
Yeah, it's a very difficult issue to discuss and answer because there's so little. I mean, there's a lack of information and a lack of transparency. But I'm a bit controversial on this point, and I acknowledge that. I've been to Xinjiang 7 times, both as in my previous official capacity as ambassador, and also many times as a tourist traveling around. And I really it's just taken by the place. And I've been to the sort of forested far north and the deserts in the south. Um, uh, and as I said earlier, I treated Xinjiang as a separate chapter. I'm not saying it's not part of the PRC, but saying that it has an identity which belongs Central Asia, and that's right. So clearly, there's going to be enormous tensions because it just doesn't fit, if you like, with the rest of China in that way. China only, or the Qing dynasty only incorporated Xinjiang into the Qing dynasty in the 1750s. Then there was a period which I write about the book. I won't take up time now, but I love it. I commend it to everyone. The Khanate of Kashgaria under Yakim Beg, who was from Kyrgyzstan, and he had set up an Islamic Khanate, and for about 15 years ran an independent state, and had his own ambassador in London. The Ottoman Sultan was the suzerain. It was just fascinating. And the 3 empires, Russia, well, the 2 empires, Qing were very weak then. Russia and Britain competed for his favors, and they supplied him with arms, and they had embassies there. I mean, the whole thing is just amazing, and it's in the middle of Xinjiang. And these empires are focused on this one guy with his Khanate. And then eventually, the Qing decide on a reconquest. And the story is important about the reconquest of Xinjiang in the 1860s, because there was an incredible debate in Peking at that time, because the Europeans were gobbling up the coast of China. There was the 2 Opium Wars. The Qing were really in retreat. They had the Taiping Rebellion to deal with. All of that's going on. And yet they've lost Xinjiang, and so they're so vulnerable from the West. For 3,000 years, China's always felt threatened from its interior land frontiers, and it's the protection and guarding those frontiers has been the foremost issue for Chinese strategic thinking. And one thing I do with the book, I also did with the previous book, is what I'm trying to do, as an aside, is to get people to try and think about how China thinks about its security from its perspective. Like, I've lived all up nearly 20 years in Beijing, and the security of China looks very different if you're sitting in Beijing than if you're sitting in Canberra or Washington. So first and foremost, for all of Chinese history until very, very recently, was the security of the frontiers. And so they had this debate in what's actually the early 1870s by now on whether to put their scarce resources into trying to push back the Europeans from the Eastern Littoral, or do they have a reconquest of Xinjiang? And the argument is something like this. The general who won the argument at court and who eventually led the forces for the reconquest of Xinjiang, he said, there goes Xinjiang. So where goes Xinjiang? There goes Mongolia. Where goes Mongolia? There goes Beijing. So it was like an internal domino theory that prevailed during the Cold War. If you ever lost Xinjiang, Mongolia was gone. And if you lose Mongolia, Beijing's finished. The empire's gone. It's all over. That's how central that Western frontier has been historically to security thinking in Beijing. Absolutely fundamental. So what's going on in Xinjiang? Well, I have no doubt that a lot of bad stuff has happened in Xinjiang over the last 10 years. I was in Kashgar, as I said, in 2017. I came over the Tian Shan Mountains from Kyrgyzstan, and it was like a city under siege, and very different than my previous visits to Kashgar. Very, very different. So I have no doubt really bad stuff was going on. How bad, I don't really know. And I think a lot of this discussion about Xinjiang's been weaponized, as you referred to Pompeo. But my point would be, I don't see central government policy as being essentially anti-Uyghur, anti-Muslim. In Beijing, there's no end to the number of Uyghur restaurants, and the mosques still operate, and you can go to a mosque in Beijing if you want, and that's the same as Xi'an or wherever else you go. Certainly, there's been repression of Islamic practices, but that's not been the purpose of the policy. The purpose of the policy is directed against, it's all about frontier security and the fear of Islamic terrorism. And that's been elevated, obviously, in more recent times with the fall of Kabul. There are terrorist bases on China's frontier with Afghanistan. China itself, which was not public until very recently, has a military base inside Tajikistan on the Wakhan corridor. And this is so, as I say, from a Beijing point of view, that Western frontier is essential to Chinese stability and security, and terrorism has replaced, if you like, the Russian threat to that border.
And you make the point in the book regularly that these sort of geostrategic moves, these security moves by the Chinese government, come often from a place of insecurity or weakness rather than a place of strength. And I think for many of us, that's a kind of interesting perspective to contemplate, that these are not moves made out of a sense of kind of grandeur, that they're moves made out of a sense of weakness, of vulnerability.
Yeah, in my previous book, I try and set out and understand China's grand strategy, and that's the core principle to it. Because, you know, when the communists come in 1949, they don't inherit a nation state. They don't inherit a national entity. They just take over shards of territory. And for the first decade or whatever, they're trying to glue all these shards of territory into a single national entity.
So thank you for those questions, Brendan. It's interesting what's in a name. And you're talking about the Chinese renaming. Of course, couldn't happen in the West. We've just had Trump wanting to rename the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America. So these names are actually play into some of these sort of strategic plays. We've got a couple of questions coming in. I'm going to ask a few questions, but as they come through, I will ask them. One of what you talk about is Chasha anxiety, this anxiety that we have when we see Xi Jinping and Putin together. And if we go back to February 2022, the Winter Olympics, a lot of people, it was during COVID, a lot of foreign leaders didn't go to China, but of course Putin went to China, and we've seen that great handshake, very picture that I think still in anyone who has Chasha anxiety has that picture in their mind, and this was sort of brothers for a friendship without limits. Now, what do you think was going on there? I mean, it looks that Xi Jinping didn't know that Putin was going to say, thank you very much for that picture. I can now invade Ukraine. with your backing or not? I mean, what was going on there? I mean, how much backing did Putin get for his invasion, and did she not understand perhaps what was going on in? I mean, so Putin is a very experienced global player. Did she not understand what was happening?
Yeah, I go into this at length in the book, and obviously we'll never know the absolute final answer on this. But as far as I can make out from what I've read and my own feeling about it all, is that Putin was cleverly co-opting Xi. There's no evidence that he tipped Xi off, and in fact, there's something like 6,000 or so Chinese students who were stranded in the way of the invasion. China had to scramble to try and work out how to get those students back to safety. So I think it was a clever co-opting by Putin of Xi. I mean, everyone in the world was speculating at that time, and the Americans were, with their superior intelligence, were telling many states that the invasion was on, it's going to happen. But most people refused to believe it. It was such an extraordinary thing to be contemplating. And it really puts China in a huge dilemma. China hates the invasion of Ukraine. They can never say it because of their or because of Xi's relationship with Putin, but it goes against China's fundamental principle in foreign policy, which is territorial integrity, non-intervention, respect for the UN Charter. It defies all of those three elements of the fundamental principle of China's foreign policy. And China has those principles, not because it's a good international citizen, because it's so much in China's interest, given its own concerns about Xinjiang, Tibet, and Taiwan. So they would have privately been really, really upset about this, but they had, they had that photo opportunity, as you said. There was the Friendship Without Limits, and the ink wasn't dry. But China has never ever supported the invasion in any political sense of the UN resolution. Only 5 countries voted in favor, only 5 countries voted against the resolution condemning the invasion, and 43 countries abstained, and China was one of the 43 countries that abstained. In regional meetings like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS or the newly formed China plus the C5 Central Asian states, there's never been any comfort or succor or support for the invasion, despite Putin's big efforts to try and get some sort of statement of at least acknowledging the arguments that Putin has made in favor of the invasion. Now, of course, China is benefiting enormously from importing hydrocarbons from Russia, which are now more plentiful and cheaper because of global sanctions. But of course, India imports even more than China. So China's not the biggest importer of Russian carbohydrates, but India is. Chinese manufactured exports are booming to Russia. Some of them will have dual use capacity. And, Europeans' criticism of China as being an enabler have an element of validity about them. But on the other hand, with sanctions, China has basically replaced all the European car makers in Russia. So whereas Germany held 40% of the Russian automobile market before the invasion, that's down to 2%, and China's basically got that 40% for itself. So they're benefiting enormously from it. They won't condemn the invasion, but neither will they give Putin public comfort or succor or support. I think for China, the biggest concern about the whole situation with Russia and Ukraine, remember, was a very close ally of China before the invasion. And China's first aircraft carrier was a Ukrainian aircraft carrier, which Ukraine sold to China, and then China retrofitted it. The problem is that the worst thing politically for the Communist Party in China, at least that's how they view the world, I think, and for Xi Jinping, is for Putin to be overthrown by a color revolution. Failure in Ukraine could bring a popular reaction against Putin. And if that were to happen, that could then raise questions about, the Communist Party's rule in China and what their legitimacy is and right to rule. Now, it doesn't look like that's going to happen in Russia, but I feel very much that in Beijing, the Beijing leadership feel as if they're riding the tiger with Putin. He does crazy things. They don't know what he's going to do next. But all they want is for him not to fail, because if he fails, by that I mean if there's a popular reaction against Putin, then that has real implications for the Communist Party's enduring rule in China.
You talked about the relative rise of China and the relative decline of the US. But if you look at the past 3 years, when China has been perceived or as backing or not criticizing Putin, it seems to me that they've lost a lot of political credibility, maybe not in the global south, but certainly in the West and certainly in Europe, because Europe has had a strong relationship with China. You've seen Merkel used to go there all the time. I mean, from my point of view, I feel that China's status globally has declined a little bit as a player in the global scene because of their perceived backing or certainly not criticizing what Putin's doing.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, though, to distinguish between the global south and the US-led West. I think it doesn't seem to be. I mean, I think actually China's had quite a successful few years with the global south, with establishing an alternative order to the US-led order. If you look at things like the BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there's a conga line of countries wanting to join to be part of it. The Belt and Road Initiative still seems to be very effective in building China's political influence and weight in the developing world. So I think that's right to make that distinction, but it's not all bad for China. And I think they've been very focused on building resilience against a potential Trump presidency. And a lot of industry has gone from China to Vietnam to Bangladesh, Malaysia, Mexico, and so on. But you're right, particularly with Europe. And I think two things came together. The invasion of Ukraine was preceded by a most unfortunate period for China of this so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. And I think more than anything, prior to February 22, wolf warrior diplomacy really soured attitudes in Europe. And Europe started to ask whether China was a strategic competitor or not. And eventually, the European Commission published a few reports back in 2020, that long ago, basically saying that there was a great divergence in attitudes and values between Europe and China, and that China was a strategic competitor, not a strategic partner. So that shift and break happened at least 2 years before the invasion of Ukraine. But in that atmosphere, when the invasion occurred and China's seen as an enabler by the Europeans, then it really has, as you said, significantly harmed their relations and standing with the Europeans. However, at the very latest sort of look at this, Trump wanting to settle Ukraine conflict without the Europeans being involved, the speech J.D. Vance made at the Munich Security Conference, the overt support for the right-wing Alternative for Deutschland, AfD party, all of that, you're starting to see, at least in the papers, some reflection on how bad China really is, and does Europe need to have another look at its relations with China?
Yeah, just to follow up on what's happening in the recent times. I mean, Trump and J.D. Vance have effectively sort of thrown a hand grenade into Europe. That speech has sort of left the Europeans sort of very unhappy, and we've even seen Zelensky talk about the Europeans. Should they talk about creating a European army. I mean, it's really thrown it back to the Europeans to say, well, is America your friend or not? And where is Trump going? Where is Vance going? And we don't know. I mean, we're on a bit of a knife edge. It's very hard to work out what Trump will really do, but indications are that he's talking to Putin. He doesn't seem to have certainly called the Europeans in. But if Trump does a deal with Putin, if you're talking about this imbalance, isn't effectively that Trump is giving face to Putin? Isn't that effectively slightly, you're talking about the decline of Russia and the rise of China, but isn't this giving more power to Russia in this sort of global equation?
Look, I think it is extraordinary what Trump has done, because I don't know what negotiating coin he's got left if he concedes Ukrainian territory and no membership of NATO.
Turns off the money.
Yes, exactly. No, but I mean, the power shift between China and Russia is much deeper and more fundamental than that. I mean, it's a hugely different economic trajectory they're both on. China has been assiduously building its influence through Central Asia for the past 20 years. Russia has all of this sort of Mickey Mouse regional architecture across Eurasia, Eurasian Development Bank and Eurasian Economic Zone and all of that. None of it works. Nothing happens. And it's achieved almost nothing. China, by contrast, it puts its money where its mouth is with the Belt and Road Initiative. Just last year, right under Putin's nose, or really a slap in the face might be a better metaphor, they convened this new regional forum called the C+C5, China plus the 5 Central Asian countries. Russia's not invited, Russia's not present, yet these countries were traditional spheres of influence for Russia, not China. So I think the momentum is all in China's favor. On Ukraine specifically, and I'm probably being excessively cynical here, but I actually feel that Beijing would be quite happy for the current situation to continue for a very long time, because it's depleting Russia the whole time. It's diverting the West away from China and East Asia to the Eastern Front in Europe. And I think China looks like it's in a very comfortable position at present. And now they've got Trump, who just likes to conduct international relations in terms of great power relations. It's not a bad. If the view from Beijing, I think, is more comfortable now than it might have been a couple of years ago.
And of course, the 60% tariffs hasn't exactly happened. So there was the threats of 60% against China, and in fact, that hasn't happened. So people are re-looking at, well, what did he say on China, and what will he actually do? And then, of course, there's that question about the role of Elon Musk, who has factories in China, whether he might be a moderating force. But one of the questions, you talked a bit about Belt and Road. One of the questions is, what's the current role of the Belt and Road? I mean, there's certainly been a lot of money spent, and I think the idea was that the countries who benefited were supposed to pay it back, which they haven't done. But I mean, is the Belt and Road still alive, and will we see perhaps an increase in the Belt and Road as part of sort of China's strategy going west?
Yeah, look, the Belt and Road's very, very much alive. And they just agreed late last year, I think, on a new railway route to Europe from Xinjiang, from Gansu province, from Xinjiang, I think. Yeah. Anyway, it goes from Xinjiang to Kyrgyzstan to Uzbekistan, Uzbekistan to Iran, Iran to Turkey, and into Europe. So the important thing about this one is that it avoids going through Russia. So there's a geopolitical dimension to this as well, that China is looking to diversify its links into Europe. Presumably, they feel that they're overly overly reliant on being able to transport through Russia. So that's very significant. There are a lot of stuff like that happening. The whole effervescent phase of the Belt and Road, like a Belt and Road bubble, has long gone, and there's been different iterations of better management of the loan funds, better accountability, and just a greater deal of care around what's funded and what's not. And of course, that's been driven by China's own domestic economic problems as well. I mean, China has a lot of local government debt. There's certainly a sense in China, because it's not performing anywhere near the way it used to. People in China ask the question, well, why are we spending this money in other countries that we're not spending at home? I mean, all the typical usual stuff that you get when expectations have to change because economic realities adjusted. So, but the Belt and Road is, I think, still, I shouldn't say, I think Belt and Road is a core part of China's geopolitical strategy and geoeconomics.
One of the questioners has actually made a very good point. He's talking about travelling in Eurasia and in Uzbekistan, and saying that the people he met were very much wanting to develop their own national identity and to be separating them from having been a former precinct or being controlled by Russia. What's because it's interesting, we're talking about everybody else, but what do you think's the feeling now with some of these stands that they've come out from underneath the rulership of Russia, but China's being economically influential? But what's the mood like in some of these countries in Eurasia today?
Oh, look, that, Glenda, is a fascinating comment by whoever sent it in. It's fascinating because I've got a little bit about that in the book.
Andrew Kinloch.
Oh, well, it's just fascinating. Because I just picked up at it sort of towards the end of the writing, and I didn't find a lot on it, but the bits and pieces I found were very authoritative. I haven't been back since 2017, but this is actually what's happening, as I understand. I'm really keen or interested to hear this. There is a revision going on in the stands of their history as Russian and Soviet colonies. And all the elites had to speak Russian, and the Russian culture is dominant. Under the Tsars, these countries were incorporated as colonies into the imperial empire, Russian Empire, but very much left alone. So they had their own practices, and the local imam were allowed to have authority and status. But under the Soviets, they had to all conform to a single Soviet model. And that led to incredible suppression and repression of ethnic identity, of language, of culture. And this is starting to come back, as that question implies. Now, that leads on to a bigger question, because you've got, if you like, this contest, Russia, China for influence. I argue that it's all sort of going China's way simply because of its great economic weight. Although there are some issues, say, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, where there's big Uyghur populations who are very sympathetic with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and very unhappy with Uyghur treatment in China. But otherwise, by and large, it's very positive, or increasingly, I should say, it wasn't always so, increasingly positive attitude towards China because it's delivering the economic goods. But the Central Asian states want to exercise agency. So they want to have a lot of big players there bidding for their attention and their interest and so on. And so not just Russia and China, but Turkey, because a lot of these states are strongly connected culturally and linguistically to Turkey. Iran to some extent, but Iran's got so many problems of its own, it has not much influence there at this stage. The European Union, remarkably, the single biggest investor in Kazakhstan is the Netherlands. Now you might say, well, what's all that about? But of course, a moment's reflection, it's Shell, Royal Shell. It's all about hydrocarbons. And then the US is the second biggest investor, and it's Caltech, it's Chevron or something like that. So it's very, very narrow, very concentrated in a few sectors, but it doesn't take away from the fact that these states have agency, and they're trying to use their agency. So there was once a view of Central Asia where there's a division of labor between Russia and China. Russia provided the security because of its tremendous military capacity, and China did the rest, particularly on economics, investment, infrastructure, and whatever. So it was division of labor. Quite clearly, since Ukraine, that's broken down, and Russia can't and is unable to deliver on sort of the military side of that division of labor. But now, increasingly, you hear and pick up in the literature talk of Central Asians following a multivariate foreign policy, which essentially means what nearly every small state in the world does. It tries to play all the big states off against each other and exercise agency in that way.
So one of the other questions is asked about, you talk sort of romantically about going to Kashgar and seeing the different minorities and the sort of camels and the links west. But what's happening with the ethnic minorities there? I mean, from the viewer asks, is there been a suppression of minorities, and what has this been happening, and what, how much could that in fact erode some of that sort of history that you saw when you first went, say, in '89?
Well, I think I answered that, Glenda, when I answered Brendan's question about Xinjiang and
Yes.
Kashgar. I think I've covered that off.
Okay. All right. Okay. The Russian economy, what we've had in the last few years, obviously since the occupation of the Ukraine, is the Russian economy is only just a little bit bigger than the Australian economy. Certainly a lot small. It's $2 trillion GDP compared to, say, China's about 20 trillion. What is the implications of this decline in the Russian economy and this erosion of, how much is Russia's power perhaps eroding from within, given the pressures on its economy?
Well, I think it is very much, and that's why basically I'm saying, even if it may not really be a fact at this stage, or the reality at this stage, that China has emerged as the dominant power of Eurasia. And this has, big geopolitical or potentially big geopolitical implications. So let me go to two big themes based on that the book deals with. One, what does it mean? Why should we be interested or concerned about it? I mentioned how Zbigniew Brzezinski had warned that the United States should never leave Eurasia because then it would lose global primacy. And what's the connection? Well, Brzezinski didn't really foreshadow China. He might have had it in his mind, but he could equally have been thinking about Russia, or maybe Iran could have emerged as a big power. I mean, he opens that possibility in his book. But the thing is, what's happened is that with China emerging as the preeminent power in Eurasia, for the first time in 3,000 years, China no longer has to worry about frontier security. It's no longer threatened from its internal Eurasian land borders. That has been the preoccupation of China's security thinkers and policymakers for 3,000 years, basically, in Beijing, how to protect the frontiers. So if China doesn't have to do that, then what China can do, and is likely to do, and in fact we're seeing it with the build-up of China's Navy, is begin to project power globally. I'm not sure what it's going to do with the projecting power globally, but I'm saying this is why you're seeing China moving increasingly to emphasizing maritime power over land-based power, because it's achieved a level of security in the land that it never had before. And there's a fascinating historic analogy which I write about in the book. This is just like the US at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, when the United States consolidates its territory, kicks out the Spanish, it establishes hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. It's secure in its borders, it's secure in its hemisphere, it's kicked the Europeans out of South America or the Caribbean or whatever. And suddenly, and they've advanced across the continent to the west and they hit the Pacific, suddenly the US can project power globally. And what does it do? It colonizes Hawaii, it colonizes the Philippines. It eventually becomes a big player in the Far East, with China being a very central part of US engagement in the Asian region. So I think that analogy is very relevant to what China's doing now, and now is projecting power globally. First of all, it will dominate its near abroad, as it's called, and the first island chain and all of that, and then will project beyond that. What sort of global hegemon China becomes, I don't know, and I think that might be the subject of the next book. We'll see. But there's another element to this, right? And that is, for order, you need to have balance. But how do you balance China if Russia is weak, as you say? How do you balance China in Eurasia? And my book concludes with a sort of proposal that the Europeans now have in front of them a historic, both opportunity but obligation almost, to what I call re-Europeanize Russia, because only Russia, if it's re-Europeanized, can balance China in Eurasia and create order through that balance. So this is sometimes known as the reverse Kissinger. So whereas Kissinger got China to balance Russia in Eurasia, can it be that Russia can be used to balance China in Eurasia? Certainly, I mean, Trump talks about something like this, not through the Europeans, but talks about how he sees it as his job to separate Russia and China. But I think the key thing here is that Russia pivoted under Putin after the invasion of Ukraine, or the occupation of Ukraine in 2014, pivoted to the east. But the east is not Russia's natural home. Russia's natural home is the West in Europe. And so I think this is a big question for the future and a big challenge for Europe. As I say in the book, it's a challenge of an order of magnitude that creating the European Union was after the Second World War.
I would imagine that challenge, though, they've got a lot of challenges they're dealing with right now, I think, before they get to the demise of Putin. But anyway, yes, someone's asked about, do you see, I mean, we've seen in our region the rise of the Quad and these different multilateral organizations, which are sort of meant to be, exclude China. One of the listeners has asked, would you ever see Russia and China cooperating in a greater global order? Or do you see China perhaps wanting to have its own relationships, but not necessarily a combined like Quad or other kinds of multilateral organizations where these two would be the powers that would be part of a broader strategy, non-Western strategy?
It's already happening. It's already happening, and it's really got momentum behind it. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is notionally co-chaired between China and Russia. I forget the exact number of membership now. It's in the book, but it started in 1997 with a few Central Asian states, Russia and China. It was formalized in 2003, and now India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, a whole number of states, and it's a major anti-Western alliance. Right, alliance may be the wrong word, but an anti-Western gathering. I mean, what brings all these states together, just as Russia and China are brought together, is a sour attitude towards the West. And so it's quite extraordinary, Glenda, that people are only slowly in the West starting to understand that China in particular, through the BRICS, through the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, this new C+C5 I've mentioned, a whole lot of institutional innovations. Through those, China has already built its own bounded order. Now, the concept of bounded order I take from John Mearsheimer, the offensive realist, and he has only very recently applied it to China. I applied the concept in my last book 4 years ago to China, but it was much more of a work in progress than it is today. But just last month, Indonesia has joined the BRICS. So a member of ASEAN, biggest member of ASEAN, joins the BRICS. So this institutional architecture and structure, China has been painstakingly building over 20 years, which it puts around its incredible economic and investment, particularly trade weight. So almost every country in the world, for every country in the world, China is the biggest trading partner, or certainly the biggest export market. And certainly all the countries we're talking about in China's bounded order, China is by far and away the biggest export market and biggest economic partner. And Belt and Road has been institutionalized. The Belt and Road's not just building infrastructure and rail lines around the place. There's biannual meetings. There's all sorts of committees and groups, and they're working on standards. I mean, the ambition will be to have Belt and Road standards one day. God forbid, but so that's what I'm saying. This is a big project, and it's well advanced. And I describe it as China's bounded order, and the world order will be based around two bounded orders, one a China-led one and one a US-led one. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. And in the multilateral area, UN, some of these areas, there's a lot of overlap and cooperation and coordination and everything, but they're defined and unified by a shared set of values and very different approaches to political and social organization, ranging from sort of authoritarian to competitive political processes.
So let's bring the word Australia into this. You've talked about a more comfortable China, I mean, certainly its economy, even though it is not growing as strong as it has been, is still good. You've talked about more comfortable with its western borders, which, as you said, the years of insecurity there, now they are free to project on the coastal areas. You've seen the rise of the Chinese Navy. I think when I was living there, they had one aircraft carrier. Now last time I had three. But you're also seeing more assertiveness in the South China Sea. And we saw some interaction, I'm not quite sure exactly where it was, between Australian military planes and flares apparently put in front of them by Chinese planes, and China saying, well, look, you were in our, about airspace, but you're in our part of the world and you shouldn't have been there, so it's your fault. I think that's what they said this week. So this China's projection of military power and maritime power, how much does it affect us? I mean, is it a threat? Is it something that we should be concerned about, or is it, are we overly anxious about it?
Yeah. First of all, I think the extent to which interaction tension's been elevated, we've had this for quite some time. I'm not sure that the events of last week point to any escalation in activity, but certainly China will want to have hegemony over its near abroad, or for another word, China will want to be the dominant power of its near abroad. And we've got massive US bases in Okinawa, Taiwan, Philippines, now in Australia. So China is still feeling very hemmed in by US military in its own region. I mean, I'm not sure how the US would feel if there was a Chinese military base in Honolulu. So it's that sort of notion of being hemmed in.
Off the coast of San Francisco.
Yeah, exactly. So that's just contextual, right? It's not legitimizing what China's doing, but it's just contextual. But as for Australia, I've written on this before. I'm not sure what our real concern is. I mean, there may be a theoretical, philosophical concern about territorial integrity, but it's disputed. But from a more practical, realist point of view, from an Australian perspective, China's not about to shut the Straits of Malacca or prohibit our iron ore going through the South China Sea. To the contrary, China feels enormous vulnerability to the fact that all of its vital raw materials and supplies, by and large, go through the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea, and it can be denied to China in a heartbeat by the US Navy. So I'm always sort of intrigued at how we see China as the one threatening trade through those straits or those waters, when China is absolutely dependent on that trade going through those waters. And if there's ever a conflict over Taiwan, one thing people in Australia need to get their head around very clearly is that the US would expect us to stop all of that trade to China. Like there'd be no iron ore exports overnight. And that's a big challenge for any Australian government to come to grips with. So I mean, I think that's how it affects us. If we become part of any US sanctions regime against China, then that's of serious concern to Australia and Australian well-being. But equally, I'm not sure any of that's going to come to pass. But I do think sometimes the question around the South China Sea is put the wrong way around.
You said towards the end of the book, AUKUS is perhaps the most profound expression of Australia having surrendered its foreign and strategic independence to China's competitor. Would you, I mean, AUKUS we could do a whole debate on, and people like Geraldine Doon have done a very good job debating it, but how much have we tied ourselves to America, and where has that put us? And that's obviously AUKUS is in response to the rise of China, well, more politically, more strategically than perhaps economically.
Now, that'd be a good essay question for an exam at Sydney University, the relations courses. Yeah, look, I did say that. Look, I approach AUKUS. I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. A lot of people are able to talk about it. I'm not really. I'm just not an expert. So I look at the discussion. I form my own views. I'm interested in it from a foreign policy point of view, and that's the point of my statement. From a foreign policy point of view, I think AUKUS for us is a real retrograde step, because effectively what we've done is said that our security will come from the Anglosphere. It's backward looking. It's not what we've spent the last 30 or 40 years in Australia doing. It's changed our defence posture from defence of the continent to forward projection. With whom? The United States. Towards whom? China. And so we have tossed our lot in with the United States in its geopolitical competition with China. Now, you might say even before AUKUS we've done that, and that might be true. But this is, as I said, a profound expression of the extent to which we have aligned ourselves with the United States against China.
And interesting, in Europe now, since the Vance speech is reassessing what their role is with the US, but things obviously in waiting to see what sort of the deal will be done. You say to avoid anarchy, a grand bargain, because what you're saying is the great game was, we're going back to Britain and Russia, and then you're saying Russia and China, but what you're saying is the great game right now is US and China. And then you said to avoid anarchy, a grand bargain will have to be struck between the US-led West and China. What do you see that looking like, and what are the what's the possibility of that?
Well, I think first and foremost, and this is more an issue for the US than the rest of the West, is that it has to accept and acknowledge the legitimacy of the Chinese political system. It needs to forswear regime change. And you just have to go back a couple of months through back issues of foreign policy and and the Journal of Foreign Affairs, and there are serious discussions about regime change in China. So that I think is very essential. China has to restrain itself with respect to Taiwan and near neighbors. And I think they're the essential elements of a grand bargain. Now, strangely enough, I think, although it may not be called that, and it's a funny name, grand bargain in any case, I guess, there's a greater possibility of an accommodation, which I think is a much better word actually, between the US and China under Trump than it ever has been. And I think well, I say that because Trump clearly is transactional. I don't think he has a clue about US exceptionalism, wouldn't think about it for a nanosecond. And if you're not pursuing, or you don't believe in US exceptionalism, if that's not the cornerstone of your foreign policy, then your US primacy no longer matters. And I think therein is an opportunity for China and the US to find some more stable accommodation and step back from such a tense and fraught relationship that they have now.
Yeah, I might just jump in there if I can. I mean, with Trump's first sort of administration, I think that view would be, I think, something I'd agree with. But we've seen in the second Trump administration this return to an idea that US imperialism of the past certainly isn't something America should ever apologize for. And maybe the ideas aren't so lost in the past that, in terms of talking about the Panama Canal, these ridiculous overtures about Greenland, and then on the Gaza Strip issue, the sense of an imperial US as something that's, possible in the future, just not something that you need to be proud of its past. So that I think throws a bit of a kind of uncertainty into some sense of transactionalism. On the AUKUS issue, I mean, something I strongly sort of disagree with AUKUS, because the amounts of money are just astronomical. I mean, the Australian defence budget per year, sort of 60 billion. If you're talking about 400 billion, this is an unbelievable amount of money. Projecting into the future probably will be double that amount. But it strikes me a lot of it's about signaling, that it's signaling something, a suggestion of containment of China. It's signaling issues to do with Taiwan. And in your previous book, you had some really sort of nuanced arguments about how that debate gets out of control pretty quickly. But in this notion of a bargain you're talking about, Taiwan does seem pivotal. It does seem that this is a flashpoint for many democracies. It's an important issue for Australian politics. It's been played out in Australian electoral politics. So Taiwan strikes me as an issue which, everything can hinge on to some extent. China's attitude to Taiwan, and that would be at the center, I think, of any kind of compromise. Strong signaling from China about Taiwan will matter, I think, a great deal.
Yeah, Brendan, that's very, very interesting about the return of American imperialism. I hopefully the Panama is still in the Western Hemisphere, and that's never gone away. But Monroe Doctrine still applies. Yeah, look, on Taiwan, and we're running out of time. I'm going to have to pack in a minute, but it's very, very good points, all of them, and I agree absolutely. I see it like this, Taiwan. I've never, and I've said this publicly in articles and things, I've never believed that there's been a military option for Beijing in Taiwan. And Ukraine demonstrates it's even less so. And I think they know that in Beijing very, very clearly. And in any case, the whole thing is about the Communist Party surviving. Everything that comes out of Beijing is the perpetuation and survival of the Communist Party. Promoting a civil war, which could be incredibly destructive between Han Chinese over Taiwan, could well and truly spell the end of this Communist Party. Anyway, the risks are so high, and you wouldn't want to be the Chinese leader that pulls the trigger on that one, because you don't even know really if the PLA is up to it or not. So now, anything less of, and a war would bring massive global sanctions, and the economy would be driven into the ground. Even a sort of embargo or whatever, same. Grey zone measures, internet, interference, so on. Taiwan's been dealing with that for a very, very long time, so they sort of know how to manage it, I think. So I think the grand bargain looks something like that, like this. I mean, Trump sits down with Xi and said, "My good friend, Taiwan, and I'm in real trouble domestically. I can't deal with that. So I promise you the mother of all sanctions if you do anything to attack Taiwan. And then for the rest of it, human rights, Xinjiang, Tibet, never heard of those places. I don't care about those things. That's how I see a sort of very a very difficult sort of a transaction-based grand bargain. But bring it back for Australia. I mean, this is a really big issue for us because say, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but for the purpose of the conversation, but say a sort of deal like that's done, and I don't think we're going to see Trump in any way engaging in a whole lot of issues that are very important in our foreign policy, including human rights. And we could find ourselves separating and diverging from the US in a whole lot of areas where we already know it's the case with climate change. It could be with some territorial issues, or for Panama or Greenland. But you can start to see, even though we've got AUKUS on one side, on the other side of the ledger, things are starting to pile up quickly, which could see us diverging from the US. And I'm not sure the Australian government has a clue about how to handle any of this.
Geoff, I will wind it up there. I know you've got a plane to catch, and we're really grateful for your insight, which is built up from many years of your experience on the ground as a diplomat on the top down, but as a traveller and a person who's writing from the point of view of somebody who's actually been there. And there's a lot Australia, I think, needs to learn about the region and the history of it. And I'd recommend people buy his book. But we really appreciate your time, and we know great game on, yes, and we appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to your next book. Thank you, Geoff.
Thank you so much, Glenn, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope it's been interesting.